Welcome to Midnight Radio. Tonight, we embark on an incredible series together. Whether you're tucked into bed or lounging in a comfortable chair, grab a cup of coffee and listen to this amazing story with a soothing voice. Midnight Radio, it begins. A lot of you will be too young to remember. Maybe a lot of you didn't even exist. I certainly wish I was that fortunate, but as it appears this story has reared its ugly head again, I feel obliged to explain my side of events and retell what happened in the summer of '74. I was fresh out of 11th grade with a feathery afro to the ceiling, a passion for roller skating, and an unfortunate obsession with short shorts. I'm talking extremely short shorts. Looking back at old photographs, there definitely were a lot of regrets. None bigger than the summer I volunteered at the Mayflower House. My parents were deeply concerned about my average grades. In order to get a leg up on the competition, they felt it would be a good idea for me to get some volunteer hours under my belt. Pad the old resume. It also would keep me out of trouble with the neighborhood kids. I was pretty indifferent about the idea at the time. I still had my senior year to pull up my grades, and I already had some remedial job experience working at a supermarket, so it wasn't like my resume was completely barren. If it had been my choice, I probably would have spent the summer curled up on the sofa playing video games. But my dad had made the message loud and clear. As long as you're under our roof, it's our rules, buddy. So I sent my resume out to a bunch of places close to where I lived. Mayflower House was one of the few places to call me back. The coordinator at the time, Becky, had a cheerful voice and basically offered me the position without much hassle. All I needed was to complete a criminal record check and have access to a vehicle, and the job was mine. Mayflower House was one of 2 hospices for children in our city, a comfortable place for the terminally ill to see out their dying days. Parents rented out rooms at the facility. The owners did their best to try to brighten up the gloom. The hallways depicted beautiful landscapes in vibrant colors, and smiling Disney characters were plastered over the walls of the individual bedrooms. Playrooms were lined with more toys and games than you could imagine. There were lots of windows to let the natural light pour through. They tried their best. But it was impossible to mask the tragedy of the place. No amount of distraction could do that. I was barely older than some of the patients, and I couldn't help but feel guilty that I had so much life ahead of me, and that they could somehow be so unlucky, cheated of all the memories they would never experience. I remember roaming the hallways during night shifts after all the children were fast asleep. Groups of mothers and fathers huddled together, crying. Or worse, the couples with the empty stares that seemed to trail off into the distance, numbed by brutal acceptance with no more tears to shed. In my role, I was both a caretaker and a recreational facilitator. I cleaned toilets, sanitized surfaces, and helped coordinate and participate in daily scheduled activities. On Tuesdays, there was craft time in Mickey's Den. Thursdays was story time with Scooby-Doo and the crew. You get the picture. There was always something going on to keep the children entertained. Rec time was always a blast. It helped break up the monotony of the day. And there was no better feeling in the world than seeing the excited reactions on the kids' faces. About a month into my volunteer term, Friday's parachute playtime slot in the gymnasium had been crossed out of the schedule. Chuck O., the clown had been written over top in red permanent marker from 1 o'clock to 2 p.m. I caught Becky in her office and asked her about the change. She glanced up at me from her desk, her face scrunched up. With a sigh, she followed me down the hallway to the corkboard. We stared at the big, cartoonish letters for a moment, uncharacteristic of Becky's clean penmanship. As far as I was aware, she was the only one who controlled the schedule. "This is interesting, Carl," she said, placing her hand on my shoulder. Her other hand was stroking her chin. She turned to me and assured me that she would look into this before she darted back toward her office. I cycled through my morning rounds, lugging the mop and bucket across the cafeteria with me. You would be surprised how much of a mess a group of kids can make, even when many were being fed through a tube. Next was the library, where I had largely given up on the alphabetical sorting of the books. After it had been cleaned, I was to service each washroom on the 3 floors. It was relatively easy work, but it was messy and undoubtedly tiresome. Before I knew it, lunchtime had fast approached. I had barely enough time to devour a sandwich and crack open a can of Coke before I needed to be at the gymnasium. The laughter was already spilling into the hallway. I pushed through the doors to see a handful of children already gathering at the bleachers, their bald heads gleaming from the lights above. They giggled with glee, clapping hysterically. Chucko's purple wig bounced wildly as he hopped from one oversized shoe to the other, pressing a bike horn hidden between his legs. Did I do that? Real highbrow humor, I know, but I have to admit that it produced a smile across my face as the bleachers began to fill. The effect on the kids was undeniable. They were on the edge of their seats, eyes fixed, and brimming with excitement for his next trick. Chucko's signature chuckle, nasally and drawn out, thundered through the gymnasium. He began to address one of the kids in the front row before tripping over a basketball that lay in front of him. He jumped to his feet to the roar of cheers, proceeding to dash around the room, tripping on ball after ball scattered across the hardwood floor. Each time the ground would shake, his porky body tumbling to the floor. The kids shrieked at the slapstick humor, the lonely parachute long forgotten at the opposite end of the gym. Whose turn for a tickle? That 1 hour cemented Chucko's legacy. It didn't matter if Becky had no idea who had initially booked him, or how the hell he had made it past security. Chucko became a regular. The kids begged for his return. His records came back clean. He was in his early 20s and eager to volunteer. With a sore spot for kids, he wanted to give back to the community. All the boxes he'd checked, and the mystery sort of fell to the wayside. In the absence of the internet, there was only so much vetting the hospital could do, and it was tough to deny that he wasn't doing a world of good at the Mayflower House. He took over the Friday afternoon time slot that following week. A couple of weeks later, I saw him booked for an additional Wednesday afternoon session. I became attached to him through a moment of chance. As Chuck O's popularity began to rise, his services were eagerly sought after by all the pediatric wards across the city. Parents were lining up to book him for birthday parties. The hourly time slots, later labeled as the Chucko Show, began to disappear, transitioning into one-on-one visits for the really sick kids. I'm talking about the ones knocking on death's door tomorrow. He was now charging a pretty penny for his time, which the parents happily paid. Maybe that was what caused him to snap. being so close to death and all. It wasn't so much a comedy show anymore where he could pander to the crowd. His appearances at the Mayflower had transformed into an intimate gathering, one final goodbye chuckle. Seeing the suffering on their young faces, performing on their deathbeds, I can only imagine the pressure. Parents began to request something to remember the occasion. And one day, he happened to stumble through the cafeteria. At the same time, I was boasting about my new Polaroid camera to some of my colleagues. It had been a bribe from my parents to ensure I kept up my volunteering hours. We were just jerking around with the camera, really, taking what the kids call selfies nowadays, and wagging the Polaroid film around in the air in eager anticipation. He approached our table and asked me if I wanted to make some money. And of course, I said yes. It proved to be a much easier gig than my volunteer role, and a lot less messy. I followed him around the Mayflower to all of his pre-scheduled get-togethers and snapped pictures for the families at the end. Chuck O paid me an incredibly generous cut, all in cash, at the end of the sessions. I never traveled with him to his other appointments. I assumed he had other photographers that he worked with there. As to why he took such a liking to me, I'm not sure to this day. Over the course of the next 6 months, I was able to save up enough money for my own vehicle. By the following winter, reports had begun to surface about Chuck O's inappropriate conduct. In one instance, a photo was rumored to exist of him posing with a butter knife held to a kid's throat. He was an older kid, maybe a teen, and both were reported to be laughing in the photo, so I assumed it stayed as a warning at the medical facility. And that was it. Chuck O had always claimed that the knife was toy. Regardless, the rumors were swirling. Becky had warned me to keep an eye out for anything bizarre and to report it to her immediately. At another separate hospital, there was a complaint that he had entered their meet and greet seemingly normal. But halfway into his performance, the parents claimed that something shifted. It was like the lights had shut off inside of him or something. They detailed a scene of him blowing a red balloon destined to be a dog. He blew and blew, the plastic stretching until the color faded into a bright pink. It eventually swelled and popped, terrifying the young boy. His response afterward was troublesome. He stood stiff, wide-eyed, and uncontrollably laughing. The nasally cackle that he was synonymous for. The mother frantically called the nurses, but by the time they had arrived, he was pulling endless amounts of handkerchiefs out of his sleeve and dancing a silly jig like nothing had happened. I didn't know all of it was real until much later. At the Mayflower, he always seemed professional. I mean, as professional as a circus clown could be. He was always friendly to me, albeit somewhat distant. But I know that come summertime, Becky had grown tired of his antics. His hours had been significantly reduced, which meant my hours were being reduced. She had been kind enough to offer me a dishwashing position to help supplement the income. But I knew I was off to college in the fall, so I politely declined. I don't know if Becky's actions were the catalyst. I'm sure the ship was sailing in that direction anyway for many of his venues. But it wasn't long after that decision that the incident occurred. We were wrapping up for the evening. Chuck O had just paid me and said goodnight as he was going to head to the washroom before leaving. I waved goodbye to him and the unit clerk. Once I got to the parking lot, I realized that I had left my bag with all my belongings in the room of our last meet and greet. I jogged back into the hospital and caught the elevator up. The room was dark. I assumed the girl had been put to sleep, but when I crept in to retrieve my belongings, I thought I heard something. A muffled gasp, then a rustling of bed sheets before a sharp whisper. Shh. Squinting in the darkness, I detected a large figure tucked inside the bed, a mountain of bed sheets beside a tiny mound. The girl was clearly shaking, weak sounds muzzled by what must have been his catcher mitt of a hand. And there was sobbing coming from that end of the room. Only the sniveling didn't have the tender innocence of a child. I ran. Dashing to the front desk, there was no one there to greet me. I hollered for help, and luckily, someone rushed out of the back room. The clerk acted quickly, alerting security. A portly man and young woman apprehended him in the bathroom stall, cowering over the toilet. They held him there until the cops arrived. That was the end of Chuck O, the clown's stint at the Mayflower House. It was also the premature end of my photography career. Years later, I learned that the man's name was Spencer Thompson. At least, that was the name on his driver's license. I had only known him as Chuck. That's how distant and interactional our relationship had been. And I wish I could say that that was the end of our relationship, but it was not.